class, welcome to lesson number 6. We are continuing this basic foundations. We finished actually basic foundations and now we're on to lessons in microeconomics, and we'll be focusing on microeconomics for a couple of chapters. After that we'll be moving on to macroeconomics. So in the last class I talked a little bit about competitive market and the way that demand and supply work in a competitive market, and I was trying to differentiate the difference between amount demanded and demand. And I explained about demand demanded, but this class I'll talk about demand, and then I'll talk about supply, amount supplied, and etc. But before all that, I want to talk about the homework problem that I gave you guys, which you hopefully solved with your free time. And the question was pretty simple and straightforward. The first part of the question was, tell me what amount demanded is. And the amount demanded is, basically I'm going to use the answer, is the amount that is demanded, right? Pretty duh, right? Amount that is demanded by the consumers at that particular price point. What do I mean by that? I mean by that fact that if at particular price 1, right, there is a certain amount that is demanded, a quantity demanded by the consumer, right? So at price 1, maybe the consumer demands Q1, right, quantity 1. And I'll use a graph to explain that real quick, right? Here's your y-axis, right? Here's your x-axis, correct? And I have my price over here, stand by P, right? Make that P a little better. Okay. Here's my Q, right? And my downward sloping demand graph, my demand line. This is my supply, which is upward sloping, correct? And I said that my amount demanded is the quantity of goods that is being demanded by the consumer at that particular price point. That's what amount demanded is. So what do I mean by that? Let's just say that at this particular price point, let's call this $3, right? At this particular price point, I go over to the demand line. We're talking about amount demanded, not amount supply. Go to the demand line, we drop down, right? And we look at this and we say, okay, at $3, I'm demanding a particular quantity, and I'm going to call that quantity 1, okay? And that's the amount demanded at $3, okay? And you can apply to any dollar amount, any price. So you go to the price demand line, you check it out, drop it down, and then that's the amount that's demanded, okay? Hopefully that's clear by now. The second question I asked was, draw me a graph with demand and supply, basic demand and supply, showing me price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium, okay? And again, I'm going to use the same graph behind me here, okay? And the way you do that is the equilibrium is where amount demanded, right, equals amount supplied, right? Where the two intersect is where my equilibrium is. So I go over here, I drop down, right? And the way you say it's quantity equilibrium, you say QE, right? QE, okay? That's my quantity equilibrium. And then where these two intersect, I go to the left, okay? And then this is my price equilibrium, okay? PE, that's price equilibrium, okay? And that's how you basically draw your price and quantity equilibrium. Hopefully by now it's pretty clear for you guys, all right? If not, later down the road, we're gonna draw a lot more graphs, and you know, it's gonna become much more straightforward, but by now you should get the basic graph, okay? So right now we're gonna move on to demand, right? And we talked a little bit about why amount demand changes. And why does amount demand change? It's pretty simple. There's a change in price, okay? There's a change in price, there's gonna be a change in the amount demanded, which is the amount that the consumer is demanding, the quantity that he's being demanded, that demanded at that particular price point, okay? So now we're gonna talk about demand, okay? So demand, okay, what is demand? When I have this graph, right, and I draw this line, this is a demand schedule, okay, it's called the demand schedule or the demand line, right? And here's my price and here's quantity, right? This is your demand, right? And the question goes, well, you told me how you change amount demanded, right? How does that change? We change different prices, right? So for different prices, my amount demanded changes, correct? So for this price, it's this quantity, right? P1, Q1. For this price 2, right? It's this quantity, okay? That's Q1, this is Q2 for price 2, right? So this is a movement along the demand line, right? So for prices change, we move along the demand schedule. Now, how does demand itself change, okay? And I can draw the supply line, okay? Hopefully it's not going to confuse everybody. But why does this change? Okay, so the entire line does change. How does it change? There are a couple conditions that if they change, demand line changes. And what are these conditions? I'm going to write it down on the board. So the conditions for sometimes, guys, it's also called determinants. Determinants are also the same thing. I can also say, or determinants. Okay, conditions or determinants for your demand to change. Okay, for demand change. And change, I'll write the word down. Okay, this is conditions for demand change. Okay, what are the conditions? Well, we've got, I believe, 5 conditions, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 I can write here. Okay. What's the first one? The first one is the number of consumers. Okay, number of consumers. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, just say, for example, that I am looking at the market for, let's say I used hamburgers in the past. Let's say cars, okay, which is on a new topic, cars. Okay, so let's say I'm looking at the market for cars in a country like Korea, okay? So I'm looking at the Korean market and I'm looking at cars, okay? So you have a particular Korean car market there, right? But let's look at a bigger country. Let's take India or China, right? If you look at India or China, they have a lot more number of people, right? So there's more consumers maybe, and this is just an example. I'm not too sure depending on cars, but obviously the population in India and China are bigger than in a country like Korea, right? So there's more number of consumers. If there's more number of consumers, right, automatically you're going to have a higher demand. Why? Because if there's more people, there's going to be more people demanding that good. And this applies universally, right? And unless, all else is equal, right? The whole ceteris paribus thing we're talking about. Ceteris paribus being the fact that if all else is constant, right? So if the number of consumers, right, goes up, what's going to happen over here to my demand graph is that my demand graph is going to be pushed up to the right, okay? I'm going to say that again. If my number of consumers, right, my number of consumers goes up, right, if it increases, right, my demand, right, D as in demand, right, will shift right, shift to the right, okay? And why does this happen? Because if there's more number of consumers, demand for that product as a whole is going to increase, right? It's not a change in price, rather it's a change in the whole demand, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to create a new thing called D prime, right? This new line is going to be called D prime, and the way you say prime, okay, the way you note prime is with this symbol over here, okay, where it's just a mark slanted to the downwards, positive sloping line, right? So it's D prime, and you show arrows that you've shifted to the right, okay? So look what happens when I shifted the demand graph to the right, okay? Look at this, okay? Before, our equilibrium was here, okay? And I'm going to erase these quantity points to make it easier for you guys, okay? And the price points, okay, they're going to go away. The reason I'm doing this is that I want to show you guys the equilibrium and how it changes. Okay, so what was the before equilibrium? Remember, it was amount demanded where it equals the amount supplied. And this was the previous equilibrium point, correct? So this is QE, right? Okay, and this is price equilibrium. Now, what did I say? I said the number of consumers went up. Okay, the number of consumers goes up, my demand shifts to the right. My number of consumers goes down, my demand shifts to the left. Okay, and I hope you understand why that's happening. If there's more number of consumers, a product's going to have more. Where the supply meets the new demand is where my new equilibrium is. Okay, right here. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys the new equilibrium points. Okay? The new equilibrium points, okay, I'm going to call this P1 and Q1, but it's actually the new equilibrium point, so understand that that's new equilibrium, okay? So, you know what, so you remember where the old ones are. The old price equilibrium and the quantity equilibrium, I'm going to change them. I'm going to say it's P1 and Q1, okay? Just for reference, okay? So Q1, and this is going to be P1, okay? Those are my old reference points. Now my new reference points is where my supply line, okay, meets my new demand line, which is right here, right? I go along here, I said this is my new price, okay? And my low going here, and this is my new quantity equilibrium. Now look at what happened when I shifted my demand to the right because my number of consumers went up. The quantity demanded has gone from Q1 over here to QE, which is higher, right? So my quantity demanded has increased. When I shift my demand to the right, my quantity demanded has increased. Okay, you can see that, right? It's gone from here to here. Now, same thing to the price. The price has also increased when I've shifted my demand graph to the right, right? Price has gone from P1, which was the old equilibrium point, to PE, which is my new equilibrium point. And how did I find my new equilibrium point? It's where the new demand graph, D prime, equals to the supply, right? So I went over here, checked it out, that was PE, went down here, and I did, this is QE, and both are higher. So what does that mean? So when you shift the demand to the right, demand increases, right? What's going to happen is that my price will increase, right? And my quantity will increase. I hope that's clear to everybody. I'm going to say that one more time. Demand shifts to the right, quantity goes up, okay? Price goes up. Quantity demand goes up, price goes up, okay? That's cool. Let's move on to the second one, right? The second condition, if that changes, the demand will change, is the fact that the tastes and preferences of a consumer changes, right? So let me write that down and then I'll explain to you guys what that really means. Okay, so tastes, for or I'm going to use a slash, right? Preferences. It says change. Now, what do I mean when I say that my tastes and preferences change? I believe that's an E. I'm sorry for the spelling. But, you know, what happens about tastes and preferences change? Well, what are my tastes? Okay, so say, for example, as a consumer, right, when we're talking about cars, that was our example that we used, right? Our example was, let's say that normally people prefer to use, sedans, okay? That's their tastes, okay? So a country like Korea, right, let's say that they prefer to use sedans, okay? So this is our taste. For some reason, let's say our tastes have changed. Instead of liking sedans, people like SUVs, right? Which are another good, right? So if the demand for these other goods increase, right, like SUV, and the tastes have changed for sedans, what do you think is going to happen to the demand for cars, right? People don't like cars anymore. The sedans they don't like anymore. So the demand for sedans is actually going to shift to the left, okay? And I'm going to show how that works on this graph, right? The way that works is if say, for example, that the people in Korea, right, for some reason, they don't want sedans anymore. They like SUVs. And we're talking about the sedan market, okay? What's going to happen is that your demand graph is going to shift to the left because demand for sedans is going to fall, right? And alternatively, demand for the SUV market is going to increase. But let's talk about the sedan market. So my tastes have changed. People now like SUVs instead of sedans. So demand is going to drop. And the way we show that is that we show the demand graph moving to the left, okay? So as of this one, previous example, I shifted to the right. Now I'm going to shift to the left. The way we do that is that we just draw two arrows, right? Like this, right? And we draw a new demand graph. It's kind of like that, okay? That's parallel, and this should be parallel to all the demand graphs. Okay, guys? It should be parallel. And I'm going to call this D double prime, okay? And the way you do double prime is you just draw two marks, kind of like that, okay? That's double prime. D double prime is the second graph that I've drawn, and this one is showing the fact that consumers' tastes and preferences has changed. They now like and make QE, Q2, okay? and PE, P2. Why am I doing that? Because I want to show you guys the new equilibrium, okay? Hope everyone is with me. So the old equilibrium was at P2, Q2, right? And now I'm going to shift it to the new equilibrium, which I'm going to say is PE and QE. Now, where does my new demand graph, which is demand double prime, meet the supply, right? So it meets right over here, right? You see this, okay? This is the new demand that I drew, okay? And this is the supply line. It stayed constant, so nothing has moved for supply. And I look at this and I see where they meet, and this is where my quantity and price are, right? So I go here, this is my price equilibrium. I go over here, drop down, that's my quantity equilibrium, okay? Look at what happened. When I shifted the demand to the left, okay, it's the exact opposite of a shift to the right, right? What do I mean by that? Quantity has now decreased, right? Look at my price. Price went from here, right? Or if I shifted from here to PE, which is down. So it went down, right? So if I shift my demand to the left, price and quantity demanded will fall. If I shift my demand to the right, price and quantity demanded will go up. Okay, I hope everyone follows that. I'll draw a chart later on summarizing all the effects, but understand that when my tastes and preferences have changed, it really depends. My demand will shift as well. Okay, and if the tastes have changed from sedans to the SUV market, and this was a sedan market, then the demand for sedans is going to fall. Okay, and we're going to shift to the left. I hope everyone understands that. All right, moving on. What's the next one? It's the price of related goods, substitute and complements. And there is complementary. Complementary. Okay, so this is the price of related goods, and there's two kinds, substitute and complementary. Now, I've kind of explained this in prior classes. A substitute good is something that you can substitute for that good. What do I mean by that? So say you have two kind of foods, okay? So a typical example that's given in classes in the US is that it's a hamburger versus a hot dog, right? There are two kinds of foods, okay, and that you can choose, right? You can either have a hamburger or a hot dog, and you can substitute one for each other, right? Either way, you're going to be full in your tummy, right? They both are pretty good foods, right? So hamburger and hot dogs are substitute goods. What's complementary? What do you go with a hot dog? Well, a hot dog requires something like mustard or ketchup, and that's a complementary good, right? So let me give you another example of substitute and complementary, okay? So a substitute good for, let's say, a sedan, right, is an SUV, okay? Both of them are going to take you from point A to point B, right? So it's a substitute good. What would be a complementary good to a sedan? Well, think about it. I'm sure all of you have examples, but the complementary good I can think about for a sedan would be something like, let's say, seat belts, right? If you have a car, you're going to need seat belts, okay? Of course, these days seat belts come standard with every car, but let's say, for example, that obviously you need seat belts for a car, so that's complementary, right? The more cars you create, you obviously need more seat belts, okay? So the more number of sedans you create, it's not necessary you want to create more SUVs, right? In fact, they're substitute goods, right? So that's the basic example of substitute and complementary. And what happens when the price of related goods changes? So say, for example, right, all of a sudden when you compare sedans to SUVs, right, SUVs are a heck of a lot cheaper, okay? So the price of a substitute good, right, which is an SUV, is going to be cheaper than the price of a sedan, okay? So if my price of a substitute good falls down, right, my demand for the good will actually shift to the left. Because what people are going to do is, if the substitute good is cheaper, they're going to buy more of that good. Does that make sense? Conversely, if the substitute good is more expensive, right, what they're going to do is the demand is going to shift to the right because they're going to buy more of this particular good. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right. So for complementary goods like sedans and seat belts, okay, so we have a car, we have seat belts that people use, right? For complementary goods, it's more direct relationship. What's going to happen is, if the price of a complementary good is more expensive, right, the demand for that good is actually going to fall down, right? And if a complementary good is cheaper, what's going to happen is the demand of the good is going to increase. So the changes that happens to demand for substitute and complementary is opposite. Okay, I hope everyone understands that. Okay, it's really important that you understand the differences between substitute and complementary groups, and I can give you guys examples later on to kind of emphasize the differences. But understand that price of related goods changes your demand, right? And it depends on which one you're dealing with. Okay, now number 4, I'm going to move over here, right? I'm going to write down 4 and 5 for you guys, right? So 4 is the consumer's income. And this is pretty interesting too, okay? So I'm going to write that down. Consumer, that's an O. Consumer's income. And what do I mean by this? And 2 key terms when I talk about consumer income that you have to really know about is inferior goods and normal goods, okay? Really important. So I'm going to write that down. Inferior versus normal, okay? So inferior versus normal goods. What are inferior goods and what are normal goods, okay? So an inferior good is a good that when your income goes down, right, you consume more of, right? So inferior, right, generally means that you don't want that particular item, right? What do I mean by this, all right? So let's say that you have 3 types of food, okay? You have food like, I don't know, maybe you have, let's say you have 3 kinds of food, okay? You have pizza, right? Right? You have a very expensive food. Let's say that you have steak, which is more expensive. And let's say that these are the 2 goods. Well, let's create one more good. Okay, let's create a very cheap food. Let's say cheap. What's really relatively cheap? Let's say hot dogs are cheaper. Okay. So let's say that your pizza generally costs about $5. This costs about $2, and this costs about $10. Right? So your steak is your luxury good, right? It's luxurious. If you want to have steak, it's a big deal, right? Pizza is your everyday food, right? You can have it, right? And hot dogs are cheaper, right? So just in terms of being cheap, you can buy more hot dogs. Now, this really doesn't apply that well to it, but my point is that in our case, a hot dog, right? Hot dogs, because they're cheap, will be inferior goods, okay? And pizza would be your normal good, okay? What happens? When your consumer's income goes up, people will consume more of your normal good, right? And our normal good in this case, that what I've said was pizza. So if my consumer's income goes up, right? If it increases, right? What's going to happen is people are going to consume more of pizza or steak, which is luxurious, right? But they're going to consume less of these hot dogs. But if my consumer's income goes down, right? My income goes down, they're going to consume more of the inferior good hot dogs because it's cheaper. Okay, does that make sense? Typically speaking, another example would be, say you go to a store, right? And there is a really prestigious brand, right? So like I'm gonna say, let's take a really expensive piece of clothing like Armani, okay? Armani is really expensive, right? But then you have a standard brand, okay, brand X, right? No one knows about it, right? It's your local store, okay? If you make more money, what are you going to buy? You're going to buy the more expensive t-shirt because you can afford it, right? But if the income goes low, right, you make less money for some reason, right? You're going to consume the cheaper good because you can afford that. Okay, does that make sense? So that's why it's really important to know about inferior and normal goods. Your normal goods are the goods that you'll buy in general, and you'll buy even more if your consumer's income goes up. Your inferior goods are the goods that are cheaper, and you'll buy more if the income goes down, okay? Now, coming back to the main point is, how does this affect the demand, okay? So say, for example, that your consumer's income in a country, so for some reason, is going up, okay? Let's take a developing economy like Brazil, okay? So say Brazil, right, all of a sudden the GDP is going up, people are making more money, things are good, right? So what's going to happen is that if your consumer's income is going up in a country, looking over here, right, my demand graph is actually going to shift to the right, okay? Because my people, right, in the country of Brazil, right, can afford more things and their demand for goods will go up. Generally speaking, if someone is richer, right, they can consume more of that good because they can afford it, okay? It's just the way economics work, right? So if my consumer income goes up, my demand shifts to the right. If my consumer income goes down, what's going to happen is it's going to shift to the left because people can afford less. And understand the relationship between inferior and normal goods. Income goes up, consume more of normal goods. Income goes down, consume more of inferior goods. Does that make sense? All right. So my last one, all right, I'm gonna erase this part, okay? I'm gonna erase number 1. Hopefully you guys have it down, right? My last one is number 5, okay? What's number 5? The price expectation, okay? So let me write that down. Price expectation. Okay? Price expectation. All right, so what is this price expectation, right? We've talked about this before in class. When you say price expectation, it is the expected price by the consumer, you, right, or the supplier, it just depends, right? In this case, it's the consumer because we're talking about demand, right? It's the expected price that, you know, people think that the price is gonna go towards. What does all that mean? Well, say for example that I was dealing with cameras, okay? I want to buy a camera, okay? And for some reason, I think that the price expectation, right? I think that, sorry, price expectation here. I think that for some reason, the price of cameras is going to go up, okay, in the future, okay? So you can actually say this is the future price expectation. So I can write it down in parentheses that it's future. Okay? So say for example that I think the price of cameras is going to go up in the future. And if I want a camera, what I'm going to do right now is go to the store and buy the current price that the camera is at, because I know in the future price is going to go up. It's going to be more expensive. Does that make sense? All right, guys? Similarly, if I think the price expectation in the future is going to go down, if I think the price in the future is going to go down, my demand is going to shift left, because what's going to happen is me as a consumer, I want to wait and I want to buy the camera later on. Okay? Does that make sense? Really important. Price expectation also affects the demand for the particular group, for the demand for the demand changes in the market. Okay? So these are the 5 particular conditions that if they get affected, the demand graph gets affected as well, right? And then later on in the next lessons, I'll talk about amount supplied versus supplied and how the supply graph actually changes, because for now, supply has been constant, right? And then we'll get into real fun stuff when you shift both demand and supply, and it's going to be great. But before all that, let me do a quick recap real quick. We talked about amount demanded, right? We talked about the difference between amount demanded and demand, right? We talked about how demand changes, the 5 reasons why demand changes, and we went over each one, right? The one that I erased was the number of consumers, right? I gave you examples for each one, explained one detail. So really know why a demand graph changes in a competitive market, right? Know the conditions, right? Apart from that, later on we're gonna move on to supply and the changes in supply. So before I let you guys go and go to your regular lives, I want to ask you one homework question about today's lesson, right? The question is, surprise, surprise. Tell me the 5 reasons why a demand graph, the demand line will change, demand schedule will change. Okay, 5 reasons why the demand line will change. Apart from that, I want you to explain what's the difference between inferior goods and normal goods, okay? Inferior goods and normal goods, what's the difference? Tell me the 5 reasons why demand changes, okay? Good luck, and I hope to see you guys in lesson number 7. All right, take care.